Jacob Rugh is Associate Professor of Sociology at Brigham Young University. His research focuses on race, residential segregation, and immigration in the United States. He has a long list of publications and accomplishments. I'll just mention a few. In 2018, he was awarded the prestigious BYU Alcuin Fellowship Teaching Award from BYU Undergraduate Education. And in 2016, he received the John Hope Franklin Prize from Law and Society Association for Best Article on Race, Racism, and the Law, deriving from a study of mortgage lending in Baltimore from 2000 to 2008 during the real estate market and U.S. economic recession. He received his PhD in public affairs from Princeton University, as well as an MPA and URP from Princeton, and a BS in economics from Brigham Young University. The title for today's lecture, Black and Latino Homeownership, Implications for Voter Turnout and the 2020 Election. Please join the Kennedy Center in a warm welcome for Professor Jake Rugh.
Thank you so much, Corey, for that introduction, and Dr. Hadfield for the prayer. I'm excited to be here today, and I want to thank and acknowledge all of the Kennedy Center faculty, professionals, and student staff in particular who've helped so much to make this be a great first time speaking. And one other thing about my bio is I did have a minor in Latin American Studies, so my time in the Kennedy Center goes back a ways. Right now, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and people are beginning to slowly realize that this may go on for a while. We may not even be halfway there right now. We can see that Black, Native American, and Latino Americans have been disproportionately devastated by this crisis. These are unadjusted death rates. You can see them rise over time. And when you adjust for age, you can see that things get even worse. Here, every single group, except for the white population, which is the oldest population by racial group, the rates get higher when you adjust for age, particularly for Latino Americans, with their Black and Latino and Native Americans being absolutely devastated at a rate more than 3 times as high the death rate among white Americans. Over a decade ago, we had another crisis that took many years to play out, the housing crisis, where homeowners were devastated by foreclosures. We can see here that if you just look at all owners, 1 in 5 Latinos lost their home, 1 in 6 Black homeowners, compared to only 1 in 13 white homeowners. It was called a crisis because in normal times, usually only about 1 in 50 homeowners lose their home. When we line these things up, we see an incredible and disturbing historical echo here with the housing crisis of a decade ago at the bottom and the novel coronavirus pandemic crisis here at the top. We see the same racial disparities, and this should invite us to understand how inequality affects our democracy and how it is shaping people's lives and literally taking their lives. Recall in early July there was a big peak, and it came a little bit later here in Utah. We are, I think, currently in the orange, between 10 and 15% positivity rate. Arizona is being particularly devastated at this time, and I want to show you something just so you can understand one example of what these two crises look like on the ground. This is the city of Phoenix, which is the 5th largest city in America, and you can see here when you look at the foreclosure hotspots from 2008 when the crisis was in its first year, there are 4 zip codes that stand out in the neighborhood of Maryvale, Phoenix. When you look at those zip codes again, here on the graph to your right, you can see those 4 zip codes have some of the highest COVID-19 case rates, as well as having the highest foreclosure rates, not only in Arizona, but in the country. So we can see this being played out and again, disproportionately affecting, here in this case, Latino Americans as well as Black Americans. So I have 3 key points for today. First is that Black home ownership peaked in 2004. It's gone down. It reached a new low in 2019, the lowest since 1968. It has risen a little bit in the first 2 quarters of 2020. We'll see if that maintains. I'm going to show you state-level evidence nationally that lower black home ownership leads to lower black voter turnout, and I'll show you a little bit about the state of Michigan. Then I want to tell you about my other research article on Latino homeownership declines and implications in Florida. Interestingly, among the Latino population in the last election, about 28% of Latinos voted Republican. About 3 in 10 or 1/3 Latinos vote Republican. So in this case, there was a disproportionate difference where Latino Democrats and independents were much like their black American neighbors in Florida, where they were less likely to turn out, but not Latino Republicans. And then I'll tell you the implication for 2020 at the end of this talk, so stay tuned. So here on the left is home ownership by race. You can see two things. Clearly there's a tremendous gap between white Americans and other racial groups. In particular, you can see black and Latino Americans started off in the year 2000 about the same homeownership rate. Today, the Latino homeownership rate has recovered from its peak back to 50%, whereas the black homeownership rate is still much lower than its peak at 45%. On the right, you can see voter turnout. This is just among U.S. citizens of voting age, and these are adjusted turnout rates. And you can see that the white voter turnout rate increased in the last election. The black voter turnout rate decreased substantially. Many attribute that to no longer having Barack Obama on the ballot, and I will complicate that story a little bit today and talk about some other reasons. But I wanted to point out that in 2008, the last time we had a very immediate national crisis, in the month of September, several financial institutions failed, stock markets plummeted, there were rescues of these institutions. In 2008, it was all a very fast-moving story. Some of the students who just began BYU may be too young to remember that, but for those of us that do, it was much like the news environment of this past week or so, very much a crisis mode. So I wanted to show you these data on both home ownership and voter turnout, just so you have an idea of kind of what the lay of the land is going into more detailed analysis. Let's talk a little bit about wealth and home ownership. Home ownership is important because it is the largest source of household wealth, especially for people of color in the United States. You can see here that in 2000, black American households owned about 16 cents per every dollar owned by white households. Today, that has decreased to 10 cents on the dollar. So that's a 10-to-1 ratio when the income gap is closer to 2-to-1. You can see here these gaps have grown over time. There on the left, the black-white gap at 10-to-1 that I mentioned, and the Latino-white gap on the right at 8-to-1. Education does not explain racial wealth gaps. Education does not explain these gaps. This is one of the most authoritative studies by Federal Reserve economists showing that black and Hispanic Americans who complete college and have a college degree saw their wealth decline from 1992 to 2013. Their wealth declined, and much of that is what you see on the right because they take on much higher debt loads in terms of mortgage debt as well as student loan debt, as we saw in this graph with rising student loan debt among black Americans. So in the final analysis in 2016, you can see that white American households whose head of the household only completed high school have much more wealth and assets than do Hispanic or black Americans that completed college. So in terms of black home ownership in particular, we know it's so much lower because of a past cycle. We don't have time to go into this, but we know that cycle began with slavery in this country, continued with Jim Crow, racial redlining that denied mortgages for home loans on the basis of race and neighborhood racial composition, as well as other practices such as subprime loans that were marketed disproportionately to black and Latino communities. Today, we know that black homeowners enjoy a much lower return on their home, that it appreciates at lower rates, that they are paid lower wages for the same type of education, even with the same field of study. And we've seen that there's been a massive decline in ownership after the last crisis a decade ago, and that has reduced wealth and made it harder to put down money to buy a home today, continuing the cycle. There's been a number of influential books and articles written in the last 10 years. I just want to point out that Nathan Connolly and Jessica Traunstein, these two professors, have come and spoken at the Kennedy Center. I encourage you to look up their talks on racial segregation. I learned a great deal from each one of them, and I want you guys to know that anybody who wants these slides, I'm happy to send them to you as a PDF, and you can check out these books on your own time. I truly hope you do. Okay, there we go. Now on to Latino household wealth. You can see here that, again, Latino households only own about 12 cents on the dollar compared to white households. This has not been much change. It has been a slight increase in the past 18 to 20 years. One thing I want to come back to a little bit later on briefly is that only 1 in 8 Latinos in the U.S. are undocumented immigrants. That was 1 in 5 in 2007. So this population has become much more native-born, much less immigrant, and that has been part of its improvement in its situation. Okay, you can see here among the Latino immigrant population, so here we're only looking at 1 in 3 Latinos, that about 20 million or so of the 60 million. You can see that at the peak of the housing crisis, half of Latino immigrants were undocumented. Today it's closer to 1 in 3. There's 5% who have TPS and DACA, and there are many more that are naturalized citizens there in the green bars at the bottom. I want to just point out one thing we saw on the left already is homeownership rates by race. I want to point out something on the right. This is just among Latinos. If you remember in the census, and I hope you filled out your census this year, there's first a question, are you of Hispanic or Latino origin, and then a question about your race. So on the top we see Latinos who chose white as their race. In the middle we see the next biggest group, those who chose some other race, and then a much smaller share, but a larger share in places like New York and elsewhere, of those who pick black, who are Afro-Latino. You can see there is a divide by race within the Latino population, so I want to point that out as well. Okay. Let's see here. Here we go. So now I'm going to show you these state-level analyses based on black home ownership, which we're going to take on first and look at that implication for voter turnout. I think my thing is starting to die of the batteries, but hopefully we'll make it through this. Just want to point out one thing here. If you just look at the 25 states where about 90% of black Americans live, there's a lot going on here, but I just want to break this down simply. You can see a few things going on here. There, if you remember from algebra, there's an intercept and a slope, right? So the slope is kind of that line going upward, and what that means is as home ownership among black households, black home ownership, as that increases in a state, so does voter turnout. So you always see that relationship. Of course, you see states that are below and above the line. It's not a perfect one. You see that in every year. But you also see that line or average goes up and down, right? And you also see it move left and right in terms of the average level of home ownership being kind of left and right, that going back kind of towards the axis, getting lower. And then you see after 2008, it's starting to drop down, voter turnout rates, right, going lower. So what I want to point out here is that in every case, when home ownership goes up, voter turnout goes down, except for one case. When Barack Obama ran a very historic first presidential run in 2008, and there was also a financial crisis. And I just want to remind those of you who pay attention to the presidential polls will know this, that in September 2008, it was actually a very close race until the financial meltdown set in, and then it broke wide open, and Obama won by a large margin. And there was a higher voter turnout among people of all races. So I'm going to challenge a little bit this simplistic idea that voter turnout among African Americans only goes up with Obama on the ballot. And the first piece of evidence is what? 2012. Obama's on the ballot again, and black voter turnout goes down as black home ownership is also going down. But a lot of people didn't comment on that, these structural factors, because why not? It did not tip any election results of any states, okay? Besides maybe, Indiana, states like that. Didn't tip any of those states that we saw tip in 2016. So it's kind of something that went under the radar and wasn't noticed until we saw it happen again in 2016, which of course is one of many other factors that happen. So this is just showing more states, and you see a little more sampling variation based on sampling error, states with smaller black populations, but the relationship is the same. And you can see those blue states up in the corner where both ownership and turnout is higher in 2008, and then it goes down in 2012, and then it comes down into that kind of southwest corner of the graph where they're both getting lower by 2016. Here's a few swing states of interest. So I've highlighted Florida, Michigan, and Wisconsin, with the exception of Colorado, which used to be a swing state. I know some of you young folks might not believe that. In all of these cases, turnout goes up from 2004 to 2008, then it goes down again in 2012, and in some cases it goes down even more steeply from 2012 to 2016. And the reason why I bring this up is to show you there are tremendous declines in both Wisconsin and Michigan was an unbelievably close election result decided by about 10,000 votes out of millions of votes cast, and you can see a dramatic decline in turnout in Florida. And Florida and Michigan are important. I'm going to come back to them because they're both places that are hit hard by the housing crisis. These are other states, and I believe with the exception of Minnesota, Colorado, and perhaps one other that I'm not noticing here, they all have the same shape of going up in 2008, down in 2012, and then down again in 2016. So the same pattern of ownership and voting going down in 2 consecutive elections, but we only noticing it really in the last election. This I'm not going to go through. You can consult the paper, but it's just the evidence for the methodologists in the room that when you control for state and election year fixed effects, such as Obama being on the ballot, you do see that for about every decline in black homeownership of 10 points, black turnout declines by about 3 points. So you see a consistent relationship after controlling for many, many factors looking within states. Okay, so now let's think about 2020. So you've already seen this, so take a good look at that. I'm not going to show you 2004 again. I'm going to rotate here, and we're going to add 2020 just based on a linear regression prediction of what we think based on home ownership. And this is what we get when we do that. Oh no, I'm skipping stuff. There we go. This is what we get in 2020. You see here that we already know that black homeownership has increased about 3 points. So that's already known. So based on that, we would anticipate, roughly speaking, right, back of the envelope, that black voter turnout in these 25 states where 90% of black voters live will increase by about 4 points this year. It could increase by even more. We see some states like Georgia, where we know it's going to be very, very close, and turnout was high in 2018, where it may be even higher. So we see those 2 green arrows that turnout and home ownership are anticipated to increase. So that was one implication for you for 2020. A very interesting one, and one that would matter to these close states like Georgia, North Carolina. Not projected to matter as much in Michigan because voters of all races have changed their minds and are going to turn out at higher rates in Michigan. So these are some of the race ratings. A little bit harder to see in this map, so I added also the crystal ball at the University of Virginia. Their Center for Politics has a map, and you can see here Florida and Arizona remain big toss-up states. I've talked about Arizona. I'm going to talk about Florida next. Michigan was the closest state, right, in 2016. And so one thing I just want to mention really briefly is that Florida, Arizona, and Michigan were some of the worst, hardest hit states in the foreclosure crisis. And we can see today that Michigan, along with Louisiana, was a place where early on black Americans were particularly devastated by COVID-19, and now today in Arizona, Latino Americans as well as Native Americans have been devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So here's a little bit more on-the-ground evidence to give you some more fine-tuning in Michigan and Florida. And the inspiration from Michigan comes from somebody else's research, and then using my imagination to apply it to voter turnout. In the state of Michigan, they had something called emergency management, where cities were placed under the control of the state for many different reasons. Often their school system, their entire local government was put under state control. Detroit and Flint, 2 cities that have been in the news in the last decade, were under that very racialized pattern of emergency control. And I'll show you the data on that in a minute, why it's racialized, in the years about 2011, 2015. So keep in mind, that's when? That's during President Obama's second term, and we saw that very large drop-off in turnout right between 2012 and 2016. So this is too small to see, but what it's just pointing out is that there are many cities that are distressed that are predominantly white cities. There are many cities that are distressed that are predominantly black cities, but it is the predominantly black cities that are a lot more likely to be placed under state control. It has a racialized pattern and practice to what happened in Michigan. This is great work called When Democracy Disappears by Louise Seamster. So what I did is I said, let's look at all these cities in southeast Michigan, the biggest population region in Michigan. We've got 49 cities that are kind of not distressed. Those are kind of a control group. Then we've got another 14 cities that are distressed, that under the objective data could have been put under emergency management, but they weren't. And then another set of cities that were distressed and under this racialized pattern of emergency management. You can see that the percent black of these cities increases dramatically, right, on a weighted basis as they're placed under emergency control. And what's so interesting is that under the two types of cities, both those not distressed and then distressed but not under control, voter turnout does go down by about 3 or 4%, right, like we saw across Michigan. But you can see about a 2 to 3 times, about 3 times compared to non-distressed cities, the voter turnout rate declines 3 times as much in those cities placed under emergency management. And there's an argument, an idea here that when people are not given control, when they're not in charge of their destiny, right, and that's taken away from them, they have far less incentive to vote, right? And that can come from their individual situation of going through the crisis, losing their home, but also under this collective situation of the state putting it under this racialized emergency management. And that practice has largely ended in most Michigan cities today. Let's go to Florida now. Florida is an interesting state. For some people, you say Florida and people say Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans are not the majority of Latinos in Florida. They are the largest group of plurality. In the next couple of years, Puerto Ricans will eclipse the number of Cuban Americans, and Cuban Americans themselves are a diverse group. Having said that, if you look here on the right in 2016, you can see that a majority of Cuban voters did vote for the Republican candidate, 54%, whereas among other Latinos, it was very much like Latinos in the rest of the country, where I mentioned earlier, 28% of U.S. Latinos voted for the Republican candidate in 2016. In Florida, it was about 26%, okay? So there is this divide between Cubans and non-Cubans. And so what I wanted to do was kind of start with a place in the middle of Florida and Orlando where only about 10% of Latinos are Cuban, start from there and then look at the entire state and see what I found when it comes to home ownership and voting. And this is just, background data to show it's hard to poll these populations. There was different agreement, and some of my findings will attempt to reconcile this in a moment. So one thing we should just note is that within Florida, there were certain counties that shifted to the left and most shifted to the right, just like the U.S. Across the United States, more urban places, more highly educated places, more highly LDS places, and more diverse places were an exception to moving to the right. So those places tended to move to the left in 2016. You can see here in these heavily Latino states, Nevada, Florida, Arizona, California, and Texas. And in that order, you can see an increase in that line. That line graph is for the house prices increasing, and then the bars are the voter turnout. So you can see there is a correspondence here, and this is based on all the counties in these states, between the swing, I said voter turnout, but the swing in the election outcome, how much more or less Democratic the vote share was, and the recovery in the housing market, with Florida and Nevada being an example of lagging housing recovery and a swing towards the Republican candidate. So how did this happen, right? What happened? So here's Florida. So on the left, what you have is home price changes, and all you got to really think of is more red means more negative, right? Home price is not recovering. More blue means bigger recovery. And then on the right, you can see the change in the election vote share. Let me just remind you again one more time, I don't think I said this. In 2012, Obama won Florida by about 1 percentage point. And in 2016, it flipped red, and the Republican candidate, the current president, won by about 1 percentage point. So we're talking about very, very small swings that matter. So you can see this dramatic pattern at the county level is pretty important that these two things are connected. Now, correlation does not equal causation, and I'm not arguing that it's the only cause, only that it's a contributing cause. So let me show you more. You can see here in Orange County, Florida, and Orange County, Florida is the Orlando region. which a very diverse set of Latinos. You can see they clearly had the highest foreclosure rates, whether they were people who were registered to vote, not registered to vote, whether they were people who were immigrants that were documented. They had the lowest foreclosure rates, actually. And then those with no documentation or identification having the highest foreclosure rates. So, not going to go into detail in this, but in the foreclosure crisis, what would happen is that you would take out a mortgage with a low down payment, and you still had that mortgage balance was very high, and the price of your home crashed and fell like in half in some of these places. So what that means is normally you are above water where your house value is more than the value of your mortgage, right? So you have equity in your home. What happened in the housing crisis is the home value went down such that you were underwater or had negative equity, right? And that happened to people regardless of their race, regardless of their individual actions, because of the collective impact of the crisis, but of course had a disproportionate impact, especially on Latino Americans. And you can see here for Latino and independent homeowners, the Latino Democrats and independents who are homeowners and then linked to the voter file, when they went through, had this negative equity behind on their mortgage, they were less likely to remain active voters, right? So inactive in Florida, I believe the definition is not voting in 2 elections. So they dropped out of the voting pool, became inactive, but you do not see that pattern among Latino Republicans, right? And some of that is linked to social class, some of that is linked to their racial identification and their political ideology. Similarly, among those who go into foreclosure, you see a big increase in inactivity, right, or drop in voter turnout among Latino Democrats, but you don't see any change among Latino Republicans. So that's very instructive and revealing this partisan difference. And it matters among Latinos because unlike Black Americans, they are more split along these partisan lines where about 1 in 3 vote Republican. So that has implications. So what I found in this study is that where you had, these more foreclosures and so forth, you saw a change in what happened among Latino voters. Now, when I looked at the whole state, this is an important test of my thesis or my idea, my hypothesis. Again, this is the map you saw earlier, and that's just a scatter graph to show you some examples on the left. Just want to remind you before we talk about Cubans again, they have a higher home ownership rate than other Latinos, and they also vote at higher rates, right? So that's not a coincidence, right? Those 2 things are connected, and they've always turned out at higher rates in a state like Florida compared to other groups, say, Puerto Ricans. So I ran a model, and you don't have to worry about all the details. You can look at the paper if you're interested in that. We all know that having a college degree among the white population is a big divider now in the vote. And that was something that pollsters didn't anticipate, that they have anticipated and weighted correctly for in today's polls, by the way. So you can see that big effect right in the middle there of white adults with a college degree, 1 standard deviation increase, and that variable leads to a big increase in about 4 points in the Democratic vote share. Remember what we talked about, the vote swing was literally 2 points, right? It went from +1 Democrats from -1, right? So you can see when you look at these change in the home prices, the Hispanic foreclosure rates, you add those 2 things up, right? You're getting a pretty big impact right there of about 3 points combined. Even in Florida, by the way, since we're speaking to a mostly LDS audience today, even in Florida, having a higher percentage of the population at the county level as LDS led to a higher Democratic vote share in 2016. And we control there on the far right for those of Cuban origin among the Hispanic population. So we're controlling for that very important variable there, and the other pieces of the story that I'm highlighting still come through as statistically significant. And that's the table you can refer to in the article. So my article and results help explain this drop in Latino turnout in Florida, and they add something really important about the composition of that drop, right? So among all these heavily Latino states in the current population survey, which is the survey that people use to measure voter turnout, you can see that this was the only state, Florida, that had a statistically significant decrease in voter turnout among Latino voters, right? So I not only found that voter turnout was down, but it was down. Why? It was driven by a decrease in Latino independents and Democrats. And so that meant that, hey, even if you had an election eve poll that looked pretty good, right, for the Democratic candidates, you would see on election day, because of these foreclosure, housing distress effects, you'd see a shift in the composition of who within the Latino population voted, right? So in other words, after the election in 2016, there were a lot of think pieces that said, hey, what happened to Latinos in Florida? Were they like some of the white voters in the Midwest who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump? We don't need to over-psychologize voters. People are happy to get the funding to do a study to go ask everybody why they voted, why they did. But as a sociologist, I'm arguing there are structural factors, right, that go behind these behavioral explanations that really, right, when you see this partisan difference based on the housing crisis, that explains a lot of what's going on. And it's not too surprising, right? The incumbent party was the Democratic Party, and some of the Republicans were kind of upset with the status quo, so that leads them to be more likely to vote. There's a whole literature on homeowners when they don't like higher taxes and don't like their property values going down, being more likely to vote when they're upset. And you don't see that play out among Latino independents and Democrats, who are much more like their Black American neighbors and voters there in Florida. All right, so now let's bring this together here, talk about the implications for you all. Voter turnout has clearly increased when you look at midterm elections there on the left. So these are elections just for Congress. Every 6 years, right, is the term of a senator, and every 2 years, member of Congress. And just to remind you, that means that this year, right, all the members of Congress are up for election again. There are many races up and down the ballot. So voter turnout went up among all racial groups in this last election, and it is highly anticipated and well known based on early voting patterns that turnout will be up again. Up on the right there, you can see the Latino voter turnout, something that's been anticipated based on the eligible voter pool of Latinos for a long time. That finally began to increase and keep up with that expanding voter base in 2018. So we do expect, again, there to be a big increase in Latino voter turnout, and that matters to states like Arizona and Florida, which have diverse and different Latino populations I'll tell you about in a moment. So to summarize, Black homeownership has been on the decline. It recently has recovered just a little bit in the last, literally just the last 1 year, since 2019. And to just recap, that decline in homeownership was a contributing factor. And if you looked at it just on its own, it could explain the tipping in Wisconsin and Michigan and those states where there are many Black American voters in cities like Detroit, Milwaukee, and others. It mattered. It also mattered in 2012, but it didn't tip any election outcomes. So as I mentioned earlier, Black voter turnout increase in 2020 may be pivotal to tipping states like Florida and Georgia. For now, just based on the latest polling and current information that we have, Michigan and Wisconsin appear to already be back in the Democratic column, just for other reasons. Now, when we think about Florida, we saw almost the exact same replay in 2018 and 2016, and that was significant because Florida was different than the rest of the country, which snapped back in the midterm election pattern of voting against the incumbent party, voting for Democrats. Did not see that as much in Florida. There is a stalemate going on in Florida between a lot of opposing forces, right? There are people who retire from New York, a more liberal state, to South Florida, but there are many more people who retire from Ohio and Illinois and Iowa, right, who are conservative retirees and go to other parts of the state, such as the Village is one of the biggest retirement communities in the country. Also, there's a split between Latinos, where Cuban Americans have historically been Republican, not so much among the younger Cuban voters, and they have been mobilized and voting at higher rates compared to, say, Puerto Rican Americans, right? Many of them come from the Northeast, many of them come from the island, they have different politics, right, different backgrounds, but they're all automatically U.S. citizens. So a message only about immigration will not necessarily resonate the same way it will in a state like California or Arizona. So you have these opposing forces among who's retiring from where, also which Latinos are voting which way, and these things tend to cancel out, and Florida becomes very stalemated and deadlocked, and has always forever been a famous, or maybe you put it, infamous swing state since the year 2000, and will continue to be so because of these forces. Now, again, I mentioned that Cuban Americans are not the majority in Florida. They are the plurality. But when you look in Arizona, it's a very, very different story, right? 89% of Latinos in Arizona are Mexican immigrants or Mexican Americans. 89%. So that means that these Mexican American voters are much more like those in California. Some are like those in Texas that are a little more conservative, but they're much more like California Latinos, much more democratic. And because there is such a tremendous wave of younger people in Arizona who have come of age during the lockdown drills, during the Black Lives Matter protests, right, and the Dreamer movement, right, and the State Bill 1070 that permitted racial profiling in Arizona, and the entire backlash that has happened among all racial groups against those racialized policies, you do see Arizona moving much more quickly in the Democratic column. And interestingly, in this election now positioned to the left on the political scale, being more Democratic in the polls than Florida, right? Which is a big, big change. So the bottom line for 2020, to summarize the research, and then I, of course, have a couple inspirational slides to finish off after this. The bottom line for 2020 is that voter turnout always depends on candidates and crises, right? 2008, we had enormous turnout in the midst of the housing crash, and big events happening in real time a lot, just like this month. And today we have the 2020 novel coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19 disease, ravaging, devastating Black and Latino communities, now moving in other communities, into college towns, into the Sun Belt and other places, and shaping this election in major ways, moving into the White House all over this country. At the same time that we can think about these things kind of rocking the boat, people jumping up and down on the boat, there's also just the level of water, how deep the boat is in the water, right? If it's going up or down, if it's tipping side to side. And I want you to think about that relationship between home ownership and voter turnout, right? Between people's wealth and stability, their social class and so forth, and how likely they are to vote being the big structural factor, right? And how people are lined up on that boat, how the states are lined up. Those things both matter. They'll both matter again in 2020. They point to a very high turnout election. But keep in mind, if Black and Latino Americans had the home ownership rate of white Americans, they would have voter turnout rates that would be even higher. Okay, let me give you guys a little bit of inspiration to finish before our Q&A. You can register to vote at vote.utah.gov. You've got to register online by the 23rd. If your address on your driver's license doesn't match your current address, you're going to need to send in the paper form or change your address with the DMV. That all sounds very complicated. So if you want to just register same day, you can do that in person at the Provo Rec Center, for example, is a polling place here in this part of the county. I will tell you that my students from 2018 can tell you that they were in line until midnight at the Rec Center that night in 2018 on Election Day. So if you don't want to be in line until midnight or late in the day, please register online. These are the voter turnout rates for those age 18 to 24. So if you thought voter turnout in the 50, 60, 70% range, hey, wasn't cutting it because it's far below 100, well, the young people definitely aren't cutting it. You can see it there. Lower turnout, big increases in 2018. Now as we move to all mail-in voting in Utah, it has increased voter turnout rates without benefiting one party or the other, according to research by my colleagues here, Mike Barber and others in political science department. So I encourage you to register and to vote. And here are two sources of inspiration to finish out. Last year, in 2019, November, we went on the inaugural Latino Civil Rights Seminar. We met Rosie Castro, who's been organizing, registering voters for over 50 years. And she told us that she has never been as excited or optimistic about the young people voting as she is now in 2019, 2020. She also mentioned that the gospel is what spurred her to action, to activism, and to vote and participate in our society. From John Lewis, who so brilliantly planned to release these remarks on the day of his funeral, democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we called the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe as you vote this election. Thank you, John Lewis, in loving memory of him. And if you have any questions for me, please feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to send you the slides. Thank you so much, Corey. Thank you, Kennedy Center.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rugh. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a few minutes for questions, and we would encourage you to put your questions into the chat, and we'll moderate the questions from there. Just to kind of get the discussion going. So what kind of response have you received on the article, and what kind of discussions has this research elicited?
I really appreciate that first question, Corey. One thing that it elicited was, hey, well, what about all these evictions? What about the renters today? Homeowners are under great protections now because the government purchased so many of the mortgages, and they're all under FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. So they have these guarantees. You don't have to pay your mortgage. You can work it out with your servicer, not throwing people out of their homes again. We learned how bad that was for society and the economy. Now, evictions, we have a CDC, the Center for Disease Control moratorium. And before that, we had a federal moratorium that expired. And we have various level, state level moratoria on evictions. Very strong in a state like New York that was devastated. New York has far fewer evictions than it did before. So some interest that, and some other media articles you can see cited in my research, looked at what happens if we have a wave of evictions. What happens if that happens? How will that affect voter turnout? If you're becoming homeless and you're in a shelter and you're on a waiting list for years for housing choice vouchers, right? Voting is not at top of mind, right? We're most concerned about people's health and welfare. But in the end, at the national level, a mass evictions wave never happened, thankfully. So we did learn something from the crisis before. At the local level, there are certain places scattered throughout the country where there have been eviction filings have happened again among renters. So that is something that at the nexus of kind of COVID-19 devastating these essential workers who are disproportionately Black and Latino, right? Losing their jobs, not being able to pay rent, mixed legal status families not receiving these protections, right? And then potentially being evicted and losing your home, right, as a renter, this time not a homeowner, and then being less likely to vote. Luckily, some links in that chain have been broken. Other links are still there, such as the threat of the virus is still with us. But thankfully, policymakers have learned and did not impose this onerous burden of mass evictions on some of the most vulnerable members of our society. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Faith Williams. Faith says, I'm curious about the difference in Cuban voting versus other Latino voting. Is there something about selectivity that explains it? Is generation of immigrants controlled for?
Yeah, so we do know that among Cuban voters, those who are older, those who immigrated in earlier times, who tended to be the more well-off and established Cubans, especially those who came in some part of the first wave, some of those voters are still, many of those voters are still alive. They are much more likely to be Republican because of the Cold War impact, because of everything that happened during the Cold War. Among younger Cubans, that's not so much as true. In 2012, we really did see, wow, Obama got reelected. You know, these younger Cubans in the Miami area voted for Obama. They behaved a little bit differently than the older Cubans. But again, older people vote at higher rates, and so when voter turnout goes down, like we saw in 2016, it becomes disproportionately more older voters, more Cuban voters, more Latino Republicans, just like I saw. Now, one thing why Florida is still so close, right? Remember in 2016, Marco Rubio ran for president, a Cuban-American Republican senator from Florida. He did not get that nomination. Many Cuban Americans did not vote. They didn't vote for the current Republican president, or they just sat out and didn't vote. Maybe they did a write-in. But today, that Republican segment of the party that is Cuban American has been consolidated with an supplement of Venezuelan voters and other South American voters who are fleeing other left-wing regimes that didn't collapse because they're left-wing or right-wing. They collapsed because they're authoritarian, right, in a place like Venezuela. And so those Venezuelan and Cuban voters have coalesced together and will explain why there be more, right, Latinos voting Republican in a place like Florida than even in 2016. Of course, on the other side of the coin, there's more Mexican Americans, more Nicaraguans, more Puerto Ricans, right? They're going to vote more Democratic on average, not 100%, but maybe 70% or so. So those two things are, again, balancing each other out again in 2020.
Emily Christensen has a question that's kind of related, but based on her personal experience. She served a Spanish-speaking mission in South Florida and interacted with many different populations. She said, I saw a lot of different political stances while I was there. What do you think would help these groups find more unity?
That's a great question. The short answer is I don't know. I think the medium length answer is that more of these campaigns, more of these politicians, whether they're black, whether they're white, right, whether they're Haitian, whether they're, a white immigrant, doesn't matter their background, they should all be having more Puerto Ricans and Cubans as their top advisors, as their top staff, as their people. My understanding is that in the past, I don't know this for sure, that in many previous Democratic campaigns, the top Latino outreach officer in Florida was not somebody that was Puerto Rican or Cuban, right? And a message from another state is not going to be the same in that community. It's hard to say exactly what might unite people, but I can think that a time of crisis is something that does unite people. You did see in 2008 people saying, hey, we've had enough with the incumbents in charge, with what happened with this housing crisis and the Wall Street collapsing, people losing their homes. They voted against the incumbent party across ethnic lines. I do suspect that in 2020 that responses to crisis, if people feel like the challenger, right, former Vice President Biden has a better plan, that would unite people across ethnic lines. Longer term, hopefully people can think about what does it mean to be American, right? And to be American does not mean to be white American or Native American or Black American, right? For Latino Americans of different ethnicities, they are all negotiating based on different states and cities and their histories. What does it mean to be American? And that's perhaps the animating question going forward. What does that mean? And certainly I think, our democracy is something we've taken for granted, and that might be something that unites people to vote at higher rates and to kind of figure out what their shared concerns are. And so I don't know what those are in their local area, but I do think that those are some things that are helpful.
Great. Elizabeth Kurt has a question that kind of veers a little bit off. She's from Texas, where she said there's a lot of attempts of voter suppression going on currently, especially in Black and Latino communities. She said, I've heard about this going on in much of the U.S. as well. How successful do you think these attempts will be, and how will it impact the election?
This is a fantastic question. I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding of some of the literature on, say, voter ID efforts, I'll take that first, right? That has some mixed evidence. In some places, people really do galvanize and respond. There's lawsuits, there's visibility, people know about it, they prepare, and of course there's varying levels of strict voter ID. And Wisconsin had one of the stricter voter ID requirements, and it did see a big decline after it was introduced in Black voter turnout, which, according to who you talk to, is either by design or not. Now, I think what we're seeing right now in the midst of the novel coronavirus pandemic is this issue of voter drop boxes and vote by mail. So here in Utah County, I think we have no fewer than 21 voter drop boxes in a county of, fewer than 700,000 people. In Harris County, Texas, the governor of Texas just ruled, right, kind of during voting, right, as voting's already underway, that Harris County, Texas, home to Houston, right, which has 5 million people almost, right, has about 4 million people, 4 to 5 million, can only have one voter drop box. And it's also a huge land area, right, that's like bigger than Rhode Island and lots of states. So, this huge population and land only get one voter drop box. That is a form of voter suppression that indirectly suppresses on the basis of race, but also suppresses the votes of people that are, right, urban voters and suburban voters more than white people that are rural voters, right? So those things are being challenged. There's lawsuits right now affiliated with the NAACP and other groups against that one drop box per county, both in Ohio and Texas, two places that have implemented that. Every day on social media, I see pictures of people around the block in Ohio, early voting locations. So on the one hand, it's great that some states like North Carolina and Ohio have a great tradition of early voting in person. Some of that has been curtailed, some of that is ongoing. But on the other hand, right, we should, be dismayed that it takes 2, 3, 4 hours to vote, because we know people who can't get that much time off of work or being a caretaker, especially with all the kids now doing school online, the school K through 12 kids. That should be a great source of concern for us, that is reinforcing inequality. So I went by it real fast in my presentation, but just to sum up, I did control for voter ID laws, and I did find that homeownership still matters, but that voter ID laws under certain specifications were statistically significant. So that evidence is a little bit mixed, but clearly mixed to negative is something we should not be doing in this society, especially for something like voter fraud, which is found to be basically non-existent among billions of votes. It's a lot less likely than being struck by lightning, for example.
Our final question, we noticed that a number of your slides drew on data from the census. Sierra Galbraith asked, do you think that the wording and collection changes to the U.S. Census will change anything in particular when future data is collected, or do you think the result will remain somewhat similar?
I'm hopeful it'll be somewhat similar. I do know that access to the data is going to be more difficult. There's certainly going to be an undercount. It's going to take more resources. I am not an expert on this, but I have heard discussions of, potential avenues to remedying the census. The census has always had a project of going out, recontacting, figuring out undercounts, readjusting based on expertise and things that are lawful under the Constitution. But every 10 years, it does say in our Constitution, we have a lot of people who talk about the Constitution here in Utah County, it does say we need to have a count of the total population of every person, right? No matter their status, no matter their citizenship. And that is a problem that the census undercount is going to disproportionately undercount, right? Immigrants and people of color. That is going to have an impact. It could impact funding. It could impact how many states have members in the House of Representatives, certainly hurting big states like Texas and California that have many immigrants, which are coincidentally both blue and red states. So fill out your census. Go to mycensus.gov and fill out your census today if you haven't done that. It's vital stuff. If we don't have that data as researchers, we can't do this research. Thanks again.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Professor Rugh. If you want to turn on your cameras, he can see you, and we'll try a farewell applause. Thank you again for joining this Kennedy lecture, and on behalf of the Kennedy Center, thank you, Professor Jacob Rugh.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.